For a long time, the 1990s have lived in our memory as a daring era. A decade of risk, freedom, and the sense that anything was possible on screen. But that memory isn't complete. Because freedom doesn't always create great cinema. Sometimes it creates confusion. Genres that hadn't fully formed. Boundaries that didn't yet exist. Films released without anyone quite knowing who they were for. Some of these movies didn't shock because they were bold. They unsettled because they felt unfinished and unchecked. And the reaction was immediate. They weren't quietly dismissed, they were hated. Mocked by critics, rejected by audiences, then slowly pushed out of memory altogether. This isn't a list of the worst films of the 1990s. These are movies audiences openly rejected. Not because they failed quietly, but because they crossed lines no one had agreed on yet. Number 7. The Phantom, 1996. By the mid-1990s, superheroes were changing shape. Audiences were slowly drifting toward darker tones, sharper edges, and stories that felt more self-aware. The genre was shedding its innocence. And then, The Phantom arrived, proudly refusing to evolve. Set in a world of pulp adventure and old-school heroism, the film introduced a masked crime fighter who wasn't tortured, cynical, or morally conflicted. He was noble, sincere, almost stubbornly traditional. To some viewers, that felt refreshing. To most, it felt painfully outdated. Critics were quick to dismiss it. They called it slow, campy, and hopelessly behind the times. Audiences didn't just lose interest, they actively rejected it. In a decade obsessed with reinvention, The Phantom looked like a relic that had wandered in from another era. What makes it stand out isn't how badly it failed, but why. The film didn't misunderstand superheroes, it misunderstood the moment. While Hollywood was racing towards spectacle and edge, The Phantom clung to a romantic vision of heroism rooted in the 1930s. Bright costumes, clear morality, no irony required. Even today, it feels strangely sincere. There's no attempt to wink at the audience or apologize for its simplicity. And that sincerity became its greatest weakness. In the 90s, sincerity was uncool. Audiences wanted darkness, not duty. The backlash was quiet but decisive. No cult following emerged. No critical re-evaluation rushed in to save it. The Phantom didn't become infamous. It simply vanished. But here's the thing. Its failure wasn't loud enough to be remembered, yet not subtle enough to be ignored. It represents a very specific kind of rejection, not of quality, but of timing. In another decade, it might have thrived. In the 90s, it stood no chance. And if The Phantom failed for being too old-fashioned, the next film failed for the exact opposite reason. Number 6. Spawn, 1997. By the late 1990s, comic books were getting darker, more violent, more cynical. Spawn wasn't just part of that shift, it symbolized it. The character arrived on screen carrying enormous expectations. This wasn't a bright, idealistic hero. This was a creature born from hell, wrapped in shadows, rage, and moral ambiguity. Audiences were told they were about to see something different, something dangerous. What they got felt unfinished. The visuals were ambitious but unstable. Early CGI tried to stretch beyond its limits, and the result was uneven at best. Some moments looked bold and experimental, others broke the illusion completely. The story rushed through ideas it didn't have time to earn, leaving viewers confused rather than intrigued. But here's the thing, Spawn wasn't hated because it lacked imagination. It was hated because it arrived before Hollywood knew how to handle adult comic book stories. At the time, superhero films still played it safe. Clear heroes, simple arcs, clean morality. Spawn rejected all of that, but the industry wasn't ready to follow. The tone felt caught between worlds, too dark for mainstream audiences, too shallow for fans who wanted something deeper. Critics were quick to dismiss it as messy and incoherent. Audiences sensed the potential, then felt it slip away. Disappointment turned into frustration, and frustration hardened into rejection. What makes Spawn fascinating today is not how badly it aged, but how early it was. It attempted themes that would later define the genre. Violence, inner torment, a hero who wasn't interested in being loved. In another decade, Spawn might have been a breakthrough. In the 1990s, it became a warning sign. Proof that darkness alone wasn't enough. And while Spawn struggled with tone and timing, the next film would be hated for something even more personal. It didn't just disappoint audiences, it betrayed an icon. Number 5. Godzilla, 1998. Godzilla was never just a monster. Long before Hollywood touched it, the creature carried meaning. It was fear given a body, a response to trauma, destruction, and consequences humanity couldn't undo. The 1998 version promised scale, bigger effects, faster pacing, a global audience. On paper, it looked like the perfect modernization, but almost immediately, something felt wrong. This Godzilla didn't feel ancient or inevitable, it felt chased, cornered, reduced to a spectacle running from explosions rather than causing them. The film moved quickly, but the weight was gone. Critics noticed it, fans noticed it instantly. What they saw wasn't evolution, it was replacement. What makes this film stand out isn't that it failed to entertain, it's that it misunderstood what Godzilla represented. Hollywood treated the monster like a disaster movie attraction. Japan treated it like a metaphor. That difference mattered. Audiences didn't hate the film because the effects were bad. At the time, they weren't. They hated it because the soul had been stripped away. The monster was no longer a force of judgment. It was an animal trying to survive. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Fans rejected it outright. The studio quietly distanced itself, and within years, the film was treated as a misstep no one wanted to defend. Even today, it occupies an uncomfortable place in franchise history. Not infamous enough to be fun, not respected enough to be reclaimed. Just wrong in a way that lingers. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Godzilla, 1998, wasn't careless. It was confident. Confident that scale could replace symbolism, that spectacle could stand in for meaning. And that confidence cost it everything. Later versions would course correct. They would slow the monster down, make it heavier, more deliberate, more inevitable. This film showed what happens when Hollywood borrows an icon without listening to what it was saying. And if this was a case of misunderstanding a symbol, the next movie would be hated for something even more brutal. It didn't misunderstand an icon, it embarrassed one. Number 4. The Postman, 1997. By the late 1990s, audiences had grown restless with sincerity. The decade was loud, ironic, and increasingly cynical. Hope, when it appeared, had to be disguised as sarcasm or spectacle. The Postman refused to play that game. Set in a broken future where civilization had collapsed, the film presented a strange idea: that belief itself could rebuild the world, that symbols still mattered, that people could choose order over chaos even when nothing forced them to. On paper, it was ambitious. On screen, it was patient. Too patient. At nearly 3 hours long, the film asked viewers to slow down and listen. It lingered on speeches, ideals, and moral choices rather than action. For many audiences, that felt unbearable. Critics mocked its seriousness. Viewers called it self-important, bloated, and naive. But here's the thing. The Postman wasn't hated because it lacked craft. It was hated because it believed in something the 90s had stopped trusting. The film arrived at the wrong cultural moment. This was a decade that preferred destruction to reconstruction, sarcasm over sincerity, the future as a joke, not a promise. What makes The Postman fascinating is how openly it commits to its optimism. There's no apology, no attempt to soften its message. It insists that community, routine, and shared myths still matter, even after the world ends. Audiences didn't reject the film because it was confusing. They rejected it because it was uncomfortable. It asked them to care, to believe, and belief felt embarrassing by the late 1990s. The backlash was decisive. The film became shorthand for misguided ambition, a cautionary tale about taking ideals too seriously. It vanished from conversation almost immediately. Yet with distance, its failure feels revealing, not of artistic incompetence, but of cultural mood. The Postman didn't misread the future, it misread the decade watching it. And if this film was hated for believing too much, the next one would be hated for daring to show too much. Number 3. Showgirls, 1995. When Showgirls was released, the reaction was immediate and vicious. Critics didn't just dislike it, they attacked it. Audiences didn't debate it, they laughed at it. The film was branded trash almost overnight. Too explicit, too aggressive, too much of everything people said they didn't want to see on screen. In the mid-90s, excess was acceptable, but only when it was dressed up as fun. Showgirls wasn't fun. It was cold, uncomfortable, and unapologetically hostile toward the idea of fame as fantasy. On the surface, it looked like exploitation, a story about ambition in Las Vegas told through nudity, cruelty, and spectacle. But beneath that surface was something audiences weren't ready to process. A world where success devours the people chasing it, where bodies are currency, and where ambition doesn't lead to transformation, only erosion. What makes Showgirls stand out isn't that it failed, it's that it failed loudly. The backlash became part of its identity. Mockery replaced discussion, and dismissal replaced curiosity. But here's the thing, the film didn't change, the audience did. Years later, critics began to revisit it, not as a joke, but as a mirror, a deliberately exaggerated portrait of a system that rewards cruelty and punishes vulnerability. What once felt obscene began to feel intentional, even confrontational. The hatred surrounding Showgirls says less about the film itself and more about the discomfort it caused. It refused to glamorize ambition, it refused to soften exploitation, and it refused to reassure the viewer that everything would be worth it in the end. In the 1990s, audiences wanted spectacle without consequence. Showgirls offered spectacle with nothing but consequence. That made it unbearable and unforgettable. Yet no matter how controversial it became, it still didn't damage a legacy the way the next film did. Because the next one didn't just shock audiences, it humiliated a myth. Number 2. Batman and Robin, 1997. By the time Batman and Robin arrived, the character already carried weight. Decades of mythology, dark alleys, moral conflict, a hero shaped by trauma rather than charm. This film ignored all of it. Instead, it exploded onto the screen in neon colors and exaggerated performances. Everything was louder, brighter, more artificial. The shadows were gone, replaced by ice puns and plastic spectacle. Audiences didn't just dislike the tone, they felt betrayed by it. Batman was no longer a figure of quiet menace, he was a cartoon, a walking punchline. And for fans who had invested in the character's seriousness, the shift felt humiliating. Critics were merciless. They didn't debate the film's ideas, they mocked them. The excess, the costumes, the dialogue, everything became shorthand for creative bankruptcy. But here's the thing, Batman and Robin wasn't hated because it tried something new. It was hated because it tried to sell nostalgia as parody, without understanding either. The film treated Batman as a brand rather than a myth, a vehicle for toys, catchphrases, and visual noise. And in doing so, it stripped the character of his emotional core. The damage was immediate. The franchise collapsed. Sequels were cancelled. The character vanished from live-action cinema for years. This wasn't a simple box office failure. It was a cultural reset, a public acknowledgement that something had gone deeply wrong. What makes Batman and Robin linger is not how bad it is, but how final it felt. It closed the door. It taught Hollywood that superheroes couldn't survive without emotional grounding. That spectacle alone wasn't enough. In a strange way, its failure became instructive. The darker, more serious reboots that followed were built on its ruins. Every grounded superhero film that came after was, in part, a reaction to this one. Audiences didn't hate Batman and Robin because it was silly. They hated it because it made something important feel disposable. And yet, even this humiliation wasn't the most hated moment of the decade. Because the #1 film didn't just embarrass a character, it became a symbol of Hollywood excess itself. Number 1. Waterworld, 1995. Before anyone even saw Waterworld, the audience was already prepared to hate it. The stories came first: runaway budgets, production disasters, endless delays. By the time the film reached theaters, it wasn't just a movie, it was a cautionary tale waiting to happen. The idea itself was bold, a post-apocalyptic world drowned by rising seas. No continents, no landmarks, just survival, myth, and movement across an endless horizon. It was world building on a scale Hollywood rarely attempted. But ambition has a way of turning against itself. Audiences didn't walk in curious, they walked in skeptical. Every frame was judged not for what it was, but for how much it supposedly cost. Every flaw felt magnified. Every slow moment became evidence. Critics sharpened their knives. The film was labeled bloated, indulgent, and self-important. Jokes spread faster than discussion. Waterworld became shorthand for excess, a symbol of Hollywood losing control of its own confidence. But here's the thing, the hatred surrounding Waterworld had very little to do with the story it told. It was about what the film represented. In the mid-90s, Hollywood believed scale could solve anything. Bigger sets, bigger marketing, bigger risk. Waterworld arrived at the exact moment that belief cracked. The movie didn't just fail expectations, it exposed them. Viewed without the noise, there's something strangely earnest at its core. A fully imagined world. A quiet loneliness beneath the spectacle. A story about survival, when civilization itself becomes rumor. But the audience wasn't interested in nuance. They wanted a verdict, and the verdict had already been written. The backlash didn't fade with time, it hardened into legend. Waterworld wasn't just disliked, it became a warning told in film schools, boardrooms, and studio meetings for decades. What makes it the most hated film of the 1990s isn't how badly it stumbled, it's how perfectly it captured the moment Hollywood went too far. Because sometimes, a movie isn't punished for what it is, it's punished for what it dares to believe. These films weren't just rejected by audiences, they revealed a decade still learning where its limits were. A moment when ambition surged ahead of judgment and restraint hadn't yet found its voice. It's easy to blame the movies themselves, harder to look at the system that released them without hesitation, assuming scale would be enough to carry them through. And if this is what slipped out in the 1990s, it leaves a quieter question behind. How many films from other decades were shaped by the same blind spots, but never faced the same kind of rejection? If this reframes the way you remember the 90s, subscribe for more deep dives into cinema's uncomfortable past, stories where the system faltered and audiences pushed back. Because not everything a decade produces deserves nostalgia. Some things deserve examination.